In this lesson, we will learn how to apply wash effects along seams. We will be covering the following: vector seams, raster seams, seam groups, and stitch construction. When working on seam washes, there are a few options we can use. There are two common options that we recommend. The first method is using vector seams with stitch construction. The second method is using raster seams and grouping them with seam wash effects. Let's discuss more about vector seams first. We will be using the jumpsuit file for this part of the lesson. Vector seams are seams that are made in vector applications such as Illustrator. In VStitcher, we have some default vector seams that are available from the drop-down in the Seams section of the Material Resource tab. Here we have a single needle, double needle, flat lock, and so on. Let's add a single needle. When we click on the material thumbnail, we can see the material context view for the seam. We see the workmanship section, which allows us to adjust the seam properties. Then we see the material section, which shows us all the material maps and usual options we have for other material types. For example, the diffuse map, which shows just a one vector stitch. Before we begin, we can hide the internal lines in the 2D window. Since this garment already has the washes assigned, this hides the bounding boxes of the washes so that we can focus on working with the edges of the patterns. Let's try assigning this to the collar patterns. We use the Assign tool, select the seam, and click on the edges we want to apply the seam to. In the context view, we can adjust the color of the vector at the top. Let's change to a yellow stitch. Let's pick a color from the color library. We select the color atlas by our Chroma library, and we search for the color 214-660. To ensure we use the same color for the other seams, let's save the color on the custom color palette. Next, we can edit the workmanship. Offset determines the distance of the stitch from the edge it is assigned. We adjust it to 0.3 centimeters. Line count allows us to add more than one line of stitch, for instance, to create a double needle stitch. And distance determines how far the two lines are from one another. It will be grayed out if we only have one line of stitches. Next, in the thread properties, we can adjust the stitches per inch. For denim garments, the stitches usually have a higher SPI value of about 8 to 10 stitches per inch, but this would of course be determined by what type of stitch you require to create. We can adjust the SPI to 8. The width determines how wide the stitch looks. Since denim stitches are normally much thicker, we can adjust the width slightly to 0.2 centimeters. Space determines how far apart each stitch is from one another. Let's adjust it to 0.03 centimeters. Thickness determines how much would protrude from the garment. We can leave it at 0.04 centimeters. We want to create other stitches but still maintain this stitch workmanship. Instead of adding a new stitch and editing each one, we can clone this stitch. We first create a stitch that is 0.125 centimeters away from the edge. We need to edit the offset value. Note that the field will automatically round the number up to the closest two decimal points. We can assign this seam along the zipper opening of the garment. Next, we create a stitch that is 2.5 centimeters away from the edge. We assign this to the edge of the pocket opening. We should take a moment to rename the seams to avoid confusion. Next, we create a double needle stitch. We adjust the line count to 2, then adjust the distance to 0.375 centimeters. We want the stitches to be 0.2 centimeters away from the edges. We assign the seam along the princess seam cut of the bodice and the pocket edges. We can adjust the way the seams overlap at the corners by clicking on the corner point with the Select tool. Then in the context view, select the corner seam alignment that we want. Stitch construction uses normal and displacement maps to create the look of an open, directional, or flat seam. This feature is intended to replace using shadow seams to define the seam edge as well as give detail on intended construction. When you stitch an edge or an internal line, the stitch is automatically assigned as open construction. To adjust a stitch construction, select an edge or internal line. Select the Type drop-down in your context menu under Stitch Construction. Selecting your seam and hovering over the stitch construction options, you will see the system highlight the stitch in your 2D window. The option we select depends on how the seam is constructed. For an open seam, the seam allowance is pressed open and stitched down on either side of the seam. This is the default option when two edges are stitched together. Otherwise, the default option would be a flat seam, like the edges of the collar now. We select the princess seam and change the seam type to directional seam. A directional seam is when the seam allowances are pressed to one side and stitched down. The direction determines which side the seam allowance is pressed towards. In this case, it should be towards the armholes. The stitch depth determines how deep the seam indents. We have two additional options under stitch construction. Wash effect adds a wash effect to our seam. Puckering adds the effect of seam puckering. This option has two more controls, depth and width. Depth intensity is controlled by the depth slider. The width slider controls how far from the edge the puckering effect extends into the garment. Note that the full effect of the stitch construction can only be seen with ray trace rendering. We can use the V-Ray Ray Trace Rendering preview window to see what this effect would look like. Then adjust the sliders as required. We will learn more about rendering and the V-Ray Ray Trace Rendering window in another lesson. For a directional seam, the effects will only appear in the direction that the allowance folds towards. If we enable the wash effects and puckering for an open seam, the effect will appear on both sides. Let's try adding wash effects and puckering to the collar edges. We multi-select the collar edges and change the seam type to directional. Then enable the wash effect and puckering. Take some time to add stitch construction to the edges of the zipper opening and the pocket edges. For the next part of this lesson, we will be using the jacket file. A raster seam is a seam that was created in a raster-based software like Photoshop. In many cases, these seams are taken from real stitch images, which are then cleaned up in Photoshop. We will go more in depth about creating and obtaining raster seams in the next course. There are several raster seams available in the Browsbar Cloud library. Additionally, if you require more specific types of seams, you can create or obtain your own custom raster seams. In this garment, we already have a raster seam added and assigned. This raster seam has wash effects as well, which creates the puckering effect along the edges. Raster seams will still have the same options available for vector seams, but the main difference would be how we recolor the seams. For raster seams, we will recolor them like we do for other material types, which is by selecting a suitable color blending type while adjusting the color. A common way of working with raster seams is to create the wash effects in the seam image as separate files. This will ensure that we have flexibility to edit the washes and seams independently. We already have a library of raster seam washes that you can use from the download section. To add the library in vStitcher, we go to the libraries in the Material Resource pane. Next, click on the hamburger menu and click Add Library. The library is now added to your list of libraries, and we can download the seams we want to use for any file we work on in vStitcher. As an example, we can download the double needle 0.1 cm puckering and wash seam. The seam is now available to use in the Garment tab of the Resource pane. Here, you can see the seam is made up of a group. When we click in the group, we will see all the layers in the context view. Here we have the top stitching images and the different wash effects. We can try assigning this to the pocket edges. This looks great. Seam groups work similarly to fabric groups, meaning that each layer is editable and independent. The options on the hamburger menu are also similar. The only option that is not available here would be the physics or all-over print option. When working with grouped seams, we will still need to adjust the stitch construction type, but we can leave out the other options like wash effect and puckering, since we are already using the raster images for that. In short, using raster images would give you more flexibility on how your seam washes would look visually. These two methods are the most common, but there is also an option to combine the two options where necessary. Here's an example where we use a vector seam and group them with seam washes, or use raster seams with vStitcher puckering and wash effect options. In this video, you've learned about seam washes for denim garments. For more information, check out the Browseware Help Center.